Welcome to this video lecture on managing marketing information. In marketing, since we've committed to the marketing concept where needs drive the market, we have to listen, we have to learn and gather information and gather data to support our marketing objectives and our conclusions. And therefore, we must engage in a information gathering process. In this process, and this is any formal gathering of data, however, whatever the reason. Well, the first thing is we have to figure out the reason. We have to define our problem. Now, the word problem may have a negative connotation. Maybe it's an opportunity. So whatever the issue is, we have to define the information that we're looking for. And this is a very important first step, because if we get it wrong, everything that comes later will probably be wrong. As an example, there was a company years ago who decided they wanted to launch a new dog food. And they did the market research. They looked for, found out what pet owners or dog owners were looking for. They created some packaging. They tested the packaging, made sure it was appealing to the customer. They developed advertising and tested that as well. And when they launched their new dog food, sales took off, but then it dropped off. And they couldn't figure out what happened. And they retested their packaging, they retested their advertising. It was still testing quite well. So often when you're in this sort of situation, you need to bring in fresh eyes. So this company brought in a fresh consultant who looked at everything, basically gathered up the packaging, the product samples and the advertising and any other data they already had, and went away, and then came back a few days later. I said, I know exactly what the problem is. Your packaging is terrific. Your advertising is very good. The trouble is that dogs don't actually like your dog food. They asked the wrong questions. They did not define the problem properly. Yes, it's important to get the dog owners to buy the product, but also the dog has to eat the product. And apparently dogs did not find it particularly appealing for some reason. And that goes back to another thing that we talked about in a previous lecture about the difference between the customer and the consumer. The dog is the consumer, but so you need both the customer and the consumer. So in this particular case, the problem was defined poorly, or at least insufficiently. In doing this, you have to define what your research objectives are. When you decide that you have a question that you want answered, how are you going to, what are the specific questions you want to have answered? In another example of market research that went in unexpected directions, Pepsi, the maker of cola, they were doing some testing, and they were doing what's called blind taste tests. Basically, what they would do is they would give consumers two glasses, one marked A, the other marked B. So they didn't know which brand they were drinking. And what they discovered was that 4 out of 5 people, 80% of the people they asked who put through this blind taste test, actually preferred the taste of Pepsi. And they did it over and over again because they wanted to make sure it wasn't a fluke, but it held up quite consistently. So they actually decided to turn that into an ad campaign. And I believe it was called the Pepsi Challenge. And they actually filmed people on the street tasting two colas, and then they ripped away the label. It turns out it was Pepsi. 1 of the 5 times they ripped away the label, it was Coca-Cola, because they were trying to be honest. Imagine if you were the marketing director at Coca-Cola, responsible for the marketing of that beverage. After you pull your hair out, the next thing you want to do is test to see if those those people over at Pepsi are lying. And they did their own blind taste tests. And guess what? Those people at Pepsi were telling the truth. So what they did was they they decided they needed to alter their formulation to taste more like Pepsi. It had something to do with the citrus level or something like that. So they reformulated, they tested it. It tested much better now, and they launched it as New Coke. That was actually with a really ironic tagline: "The same great taste of Coke, only better." Which is, if it's the same great taste, how can it be better? And New Coke was considered a disaster. And they couldn't quite figure out why, because in the blind taste test it held up. The problem is that most people don't buy their products in blind taste tests. They have actually an emotional attachment to the brand. I personally have an emotional attachment to Coca-Cola. I don't drink. I used to drink a lot of Coca-Cola. I don't anymore, just for health reasons. Just being, I want a healthier life. But I have an emotional attachment to Coca-Cola. When I was a kid, I used to go over to my grandparents' house, and this old, banged up refrigerator they kept in the basement. It wasn't their main refrigerator. It's an old refrigerator, and they would put bottles of Coca-Cola in it for when I and my siblings and my cousins came to visit. In the sort of the old glass green bottles, and so I have an emotional attachment to the brand. And what they failed to do is the research objectives were off. They wanted to figure out how to sell Coca-Cola, and they asked the wrong questions. It wasn't, how can we make our product taste like Pepsi in a blind taste test? Is how can we get people to buy more Coca-Cola? And what Coca-Cola did was they realized it was a disaster, and they relaunched their old flavor, their old version, and they called it Classic Coke. And they had actually, at the time, this is a long time ago, they had Bill Cosby, who was at the time quite trusted and quite popular, do a campaign saying, "Oh, we heard you. We're bringing back Classic Coke, and we still have New Coke," because there were some people who actually liked the New Coke better. And I think, but within about 2 or 3 years, I think it kind of disappeared. So, once you have figured out your problem and what your research objectives are, then you need to choose a data collection method. And there are many ways to collect data. You can do, and I'll talk about some of those methods in a little bit, but, are you going to do surveys? Are you going to do some other method to figure out, are you going to do blind taste tests? So you have to figure that out. Then you have to design a sample. And this goes to basic statistics. How are you going to, a sample is a smaller group selected to represent a larger group. Because you really can't, let's say you're doing a survey, you can't survey everyone. You sample a smaller group, survey a smaller group, and then through statistical significance, you can tell that that's probably how the larger group will react. Then you have to collect the data. Now, this might be a big deal or not such a big deal. Depends upon your sample size, depends upon the methodology that you've chosen, but ultimately you have to collect that data and hopefully do it in a unbiased, objective way. There have been some cases where people have collected data in ways designed to skew the results a certain way. If somebody ever comes to me and says, "This is what we want to do. I want you to want you to do the research to support it," I say, "No, thank you. I don't want to do that job because you're looking for a specific result. You're not necessarily looking for an honest result. So you have to collect the data objectively." In fact, often For instance, in the blind taste tests I referred to being done by Pepsi, many of the people who were running the research, doing the sampling, they didn't know who they were working for. They didn't know if they were working for Coke or Pepsi or somebody else. So they wouldn't unintentionally bias or intentionally bias the results. So you collect the data, and once you collect it, you need to analyze it. And this is where, if you take a course in statistics, it might help you, or you hire a statistician. And ultimately, you have to report the findings. No point in going through all this if you don't report the findings and ultimately make a decision. Now, the decision might be to do nothing, to just leave things the way they are. That's okay, as long as it's an honest, from honest findings and it's an honest decision. That's absolutely fine. You want to figure out what the best course of action is, and that's why you do the research, not for its own sake, but to help with decision making. Okay, there are various areas of marketing information. You can access information from internal sources, and these would be sales records, customer databases, production records, any information in which you collect information in the normal conducting of business. And this is why I encourage people to collect information as you're doing business, because then, if you need the data later and you don't have access to it, it's too late. So one example of this was I had a client that was a medical practice, and it was a new medical practice. It was a family medical practice, and they hadn't done any advertising. They didn't have a website. They're really just starting out. And so I went to go visit them and discovered they did have some patients. They had, and so I said, well, these patients you already have, and they didn't have enough, but they had some. Where did they come from? And they go, oh, I know, word of mouth. The phrase word of mouth, getting customers via word of mouth is great. I'm not discounting it, but as an answer, it's a little bit lazy. It's like, I don't know where I got them, so it must have been word of mouth. I said, well, let's do a little research as you're, doing something, as you're doing your business, and I just spoke to the doctor. I said, when you get a new patient, you do a little questionnaire. I said, well, why don't you ask them, while you're asking them questions anyway, ask them what, how they heard about you. And the doctor said, oh, no, that's not a medical question. I can't answer, So I spoke with the office manager, who was also doubling as the a receptionist, and she agreed to ask that question. And a few weeks later, when I came back, I asked, and where are these people? How are these people hearing about you? And it was primarily two people. One was the high school nurse, which was just down the block. And the second was the town health officer in the town where the practice was. I said, okay, that's a good start. That's great. So at least we know where this is coming from. The doctor I was working for didn't particularly like advertising. He had kind of some old-fashioned attitudes about advertising. He thought somehow it was unethical, and which is ridiculous. There's nothing unethical about advertising in itself. I mean, there is unethical advertising, things that lie, and that's fine, but that's not what we're talking about here. But anyway, so what I did was, or I suggested, why don't we have the doctor do a series of free public service talks. He's going to give some lectures, and I would be able to do some public relations, send out some press releases about that. And so he would be able to build his practice that way. He actually was very personable and very good with people directly, so that worked out. And he did a number of great topics, including things like weight loss and allergies and things like that. And so that was good. And then he did one case, one where he's talking about how to raise children, major issues. And I didn't go to that particular talk because he was already on his way. He'd done several successfully already, so I didn't feel the need to monitor him. Unfortunately, what had happened was he brought his own child to the talk, and his own child behaved very badly. And so here he is telling parents how to raise their children, and his child is acting like a brat and misbehaving. And he was talking about behavioral issues, so that was unfortunate. But what also got out was that this child was hanging around the practice. And this is something that a lot of entrepreneurs do. It's not really a smart thing to do, but because somebody's working, but they have a place they're the boss, so they can get away with it. And often a lot of entrepreneurs use their businesses as their own personal daycare for their child, having their kid hang around the shop or something like that. Well, except this was a medical practice, and apparently this child was very unruly and had walked in on some physical exams with some female patients, just looking for daddy, and apparently remember the nurse and the town health officer, they found out about this, and they said they could no longer recommend people to go to this doctor. In fact, they would recommend against it. And we had to sort of have an intervention with the doctor, because I said, hey, the two people who are sending more new patients to you than any other source, they're now turning against you. So we said, get the kid out of the practice, get a proper daycare place, and don't have him hang around. And then make sure you tell those two women who are referring a lot of patients to you that this has been taken care of. If we had not done that initial searching for internal data, of who was referring patients to them, we would never have known that this would have been a problem. And we wouldn't have been able, even if we knew it was a problem, we wouldn't have been able to deal with it. We wouldn't have known who the primary referrers are or were. So it's always good to collect data. You don't always know what you'll need, so collect as much as you can. However, of course, some people are reluctant to give irrelevant information, so you have to be thoughtful about the data you collect. But there it is. You also will want to collect information about your competitors. This is called marketing intelligence or competitive intelligence. And this is collecting publicly available information. It's nothing inappropriate about it. You certainly look at your competitors' websites. If it's a publicly traded company, you can read their annual reports, which everyone, if they're a publicly traded company, everyone is entitled to the annual report. Years ago, I could just call a corporation up and say, I'd like to get your annual report, and they would pop it in the mail to me. Now, of course, annual reports are online. In terms of their promotional literature, that would be wise to get. In fact, one of my colleagues would collect all our competitors' literature and put it in binders, and so we could always refer to things. If your competitors are hiring, if they put out an ad or something like that, you can take a look and see who are they hiring. We discovered, when I was working for a pharmaceutical company, we discovered one of our competitors was looking for sales reps, which is not that unusual, but they were specifically looking for sales reps that had vaccine experience. And at that point, we realized, well, we knew they didn't have any vaccines, so we realized they were going to be launching a vaccine soon. So that, just paying attention. You can certainly ask distributors what's going on. your distributors are probably also your competitors' distributors. And that's very important. We had one situation where we had a product that was it was kind of a monopoly. It was head and shoulders over anything that was out there, and it was an injectable product, and therapeutically it was vastly superior to anything available. However, over time, eventually, a competitor did pop up who, as much as we said they weren't as good, they were probably just as good. They weren't, really they were very much different. It was a very similar chemical model that they were using. However, there was a difference. Our bottles were, plastic, sort of a cloudy, clear plastic. You might have seen these types of bottles, and that's fine. But the competitor, there was a chemical difference. The chemical difference required that for them they required to have their product in brown glass bottles because it was photosensitive. I guess too much sunlight would cause it to break down, and there's a lot of chemicals you'll see in brown glass bottles. Well, for us, this was a competitive advantage because we'd start saying things like, "Oh, we don't want to." We'd use words like crack and smash, to imply that the glass. I mean, a large bottle of this, product might cost $1,000. This is an injectable pharmaceutical product used in the field. So, so we had the advantage of being a plastic bottle. If you dropped our bottle, it wouldn't smash, it wouldn't crack. Theirs, of course, would. So, we would say things like, we hope our competitors don't crack under the pressure, or we hope they don't. We'd make all sorts of puns about smashing and cracking and that sort of thing. Well, they reacted to that by putting their brown glass bottle inside what they called a plastic envelope. It was another plastic jar. It was a hard plastic bottle. And so what we did is we did some competitive intelligence. We went and we bought some product, and I remember a number of us went out into the parking lot and took that bottle and let it go and let it drop on the asphalt. And guess what? It smashed. The plastic envelope didn't do anything to really protect, that bottle. Maybe it would have if it dropped on dirt or something, maybe not quite as hard, but it did break. I remember one of our vice presidents was so excited, he grabbed another bottle to show the president, and he ran into the building and ran up, didn't wait for the elevator. He ran up the stairs, tripped on the stairs, and guess what? It smashed. So we had two examples of where it smashed. And so I was able to tell our sales reps that our competitors' plastic envelope didn't do any good, that the product still smashed. And now, of course, our distributors were their distributors. So our sales reps would tell our distributors about this. And of course, the distributors would then tell the competitive sales reps about this. And we understand there was a case down in North Carolina where the sales rep, the competitor's sales rep, not ours, said, "Well, that's ridiculous." Took a bottle and dropped it in the store, and it smashed. And it also stained the wooden floor, and they had to pay to have the floor repaired. So of course the distributor told our sales rep that, and got up to me, and then I was able to redistribute that information to the entire sales force. So distributors will share information. Understand it's a two-way street. They'll tell you what your competitors are doing, but they'll also tell your competitors what you're doing. Another area that you might be able to glean some information in from is competitive ads, ad reservations. Not simply the ad, but for instance, in magazines or television, you might be able to find out if your competitors have reserved ad space or ad time. And we learned that we had a competitor who would normally put a full page ad in a particular magazine, but we knew 3 months from now that they were going to put their usual ad plus a 2-page spread. So instead of one page, they're going to have 3 pages. And this was the same company we noticed that was hiring vaccine sales reps. So we now had a date. We knew when it was probably going to be approved. And so you can gather information. This is all legal. This is all, open information. It's publicly available, and there's nothing wrong with that. However, this should not be confused with industrial espionage. Industrial espionage is when you are gathering information through means that would be considered illegal. So what would be some examples of this? Well, obviously going in and stealing the information, or trying to force an employee to give you information that they're not supposed to give. Even if, and I've seen companies do this, where they would actually hire somebody who worked at a company, hire them in their company, and then try to get them to give information about their previous employer. If you are employed by a company, you are required to protect their secrets. You're required to, maintain confidentiality, even if you've left that company. You can't just, as soon as you leave a company, spill the beans on all their secrets. And in fact, often companies will make you sign NDAs or non-disclosure agreements. And there's that. Certainly hacking would be illegal and inappropriate. Also, and I would tell sales reps this, or anyone who maybe is flying on an airplane, and they're working on their laptop while they're working. You never know who the person next to you is. I mean, unless it's somebody you know. If you're a stranger in the next seat, and they might be working for the competition. I know this happened to me. I wasn't on my laptop, but I was in the next seat, and I could see somebody on their laptop, and I realized they were one of my competitors. We happened to be going to a convention, not together, but we just happened to be going to, I think it was Denver, and on the same plane. When there's a convention or a trade show, competitors will go to the same place, and they might even end up on the same plane, and they might end up next to each other. So I told this to a regional director who said, "Oh my God, that's what if that was our sales rep next to a competitor?" So he warned all his sales reps that be careful when you open up a laptop or any other information on an airplane or anywhere else. Who might be looking over your shoulder. So there was an unusual case a number of years ago. A number of junior marketing managers from Procter & Gamble went over to the headquarters of Helene Curtis, who made a competitive product. And they didn't go in the building, but they did go into the dumpsters, the dumpster of Helene Curtis, and guess what they found? They found discarded marketing plans. And they were very proud of themselves. They got their opponents' plans, and they came back to headquarters, and they shared this with senior managers, and the senior managers said, wait a minute, where did you get this information? The dumpster, which was not illegal, because once you throw something out, you no longer have a legal claim to it. And this is a case where they were legally in the clear, but ethically they felt they weren't. So the managers at Procter & Gamble called up Helene Curtis and said, "We have some people who did something we're kind of ashamed of. We want to let you know. We're going to throw out those plans, but the point is, you should secure your marketing plans a little bit better. Secure your documents." And you will find that actually a lot of companies are very careful about document disposal. They have shredders, they have cans that you can put documents in, and they're taken by a company to incinerate. Some actually shred and then have the shreds incinerated. So you do want to be careful. And of course, obviously, the jurisdiction might make a difference too. So you want to be careful there. This sort of last marketing information areas, market research, where we're probably most concerned about. And this is a systematic design, collection, analysis, and reporting of data relevant to a specific marketing situation. And that can fall, that's a pretty broad definition. But we want to learn about the market. We want to learn about consumers and their preferences and so forth and so on. And in defining our problem and objectives, there's sort of three general approaches that we can take. And the first is doing exploratory research. And exploratory research is the least scientific. It's when you have an idea, but you're not sure. You're just grasping at straws. You're trying to gather preliminary data to define a problem and suggest a hypothesis. So you should probably not base any final decisions on this, but it's sort of a first step, sort of like a baby step. People looking to, for instance, people might be looking to improve their product but don't know how, so they just ask questions. How should I improve my product? What would you like in this product? What are your needs, wants, and demands for this type of product? And it just gives you some ideas. And based on that information, you can form a better idea of what data to be looked for. What are your objectives? And then you go through that whole process. But no final decision should be made on purely exploratory research. You're exploring. You don't know what's going to be there. You don't know what the ramifications are. It's just to give you an idea to develop a hypothesis that then you would go forward and test. The next category, it would be descriptive research. And this is, as you might say, to describe things such as the market potential or usage patterns or attitudes and behaviors towards certain products or a specific product. And this requires a little bit more regimented and a little bit more fastidious approach. Essentially, what you're trying to just do is describe what the situation currently is in regard to your market. The next approach is causal research. And this is where you're actually trying to test a hypothesis about cause and effect. If I do A, what will happen to B? If I offer my product in peach flavor, what will happen? How many people will buy it? You're trying to predict the future. Cause and effect. You want to figure out, if whatever your action is that you're planning on taking, what will the effect be? If you're going to change your advertising, what will the effect be? If you're going to alter your product, what will the effect be? And of course, this is the most difficult because you're trying to predict what people will do, even sometimes when those people don't know themselves what they'll do. So. All right. In developing a research plan, you have to, again, define the exact information required. What research approaches are available to you. What contact methods you will undertake. How will you contact, assuming that you're actually contacting people. Developing a sampling plan, and that is how which people will you contact to represent the whole, to represent your market? And then what instruments will be used? Will you use a survey? Will you use some sort of test? Will there be some sort of stimulus that people will need to react to? What are the physical requirements to undertake the research? So in developing a research plan, there's two general sources of data, or two types of data. First, I'm going to talk about secondary data. Secondary data is data that pre-exists. It was not, you don't have to go out and generate it. It may not be immediately available to you, but it's already been accumulated, already been, in fact, it might even have been analyzed already. It was, and it was usually collected for another purpose. A great example of this would be the U.S. Census data. Every 10 years, the United States performs a census as dictated by the Constitution. Because this census is paid for by public tax dollars, we as citizens are entitled to it. If you want access to the census data, you are entitled to it. It is not, I'm told, not the easiest data to work with, but it is available. And if you have a question, if your objective can be answered with the census data, you can go and get it. There are other databases that have been accumulated. Other people have done research projects, maybe within your own company, and that might be helpful. And it might even be that internal data that you have been collecting as part of your general part of business. Secondary data, of course, is probably the cheapest to access since it's already there. I'm not saying it's free, because some of these databases, there are companies that generate data, and they charge you for it. They might charge you actually thousands of dollars for it, which might still be cheaper than going out and getting your own data, which would be primary data. But for instance, the college pays for some of these databases, so you can, if as a college student, you can, and most college students at most colleges can access data that the college has paid for. Primary data is data that you collect for a specific purpose. You have developed your questions, and the data, the collection method has been designed to answer specific questions for your specific purpose. So, there are all sorts of primary research approaches. The most common is communication. Simply asking questions. You might do surveys. It might be a paper survey, an online survey. It might be a telephone survey, but it's simply a survey. And what a survey is a series of predetermined questions, a list of questions. Most people think writing a survey is simple, but actually things that affect the effectiveness of a survey is the number of questions that are asked. Obviously, the specific questions, actually also the order in which you ask the questions can affect the results. The wording of the questions. And I've actually done experiments where I've asked essentially the same question, but changed the wording a little bit and gotten very different results. And I can even go to the same person who gives me one answer on one question and then a different answer on a slightly different, if I word the question slightly differently. So that's interesting. You can also do interviews. Now, interviews, and some things might be a combination of these. With interviews, you could ask a list of questions like a survey, but interviews also allow you to ask additional questions, follow-up questions. Somebody particularly helpful for exploratory research. If you're exploring and trying to find dig and get a concept, develop a concept and develop a hypothesis, interviews can be very helpful. They, of course, are more expensive because they are one-on-one, where a survey, you can send out paper surveys and survey large groups of people or do online surveys. Interviews do take a more human time to do that, but they will allow you to go into unexpected directions. So if somebody asks, gives you an unexpected answer, you can follow that path if you choose. Then, of course, a lot of people like focus groups, which is kind of where you're interviewing a group of people together. I'm not as big a fan of focus groups as some people, because what you have in a focus group is you also have group dynamics. You have people who are very outspoken, people who are quick to give an answer, other people who are, let's be honest, followers. You also have something called groupthink. Groupthink is a phenomenon where people want to agree. They don't like to disagree, or they place agreeing with other people in the group above actually accomplishing the best effort, the best result. And let's say you're interviewing 8 people, and you've got 2 people who are very outspoken, but those other 6 people might also, they also make purchase decisions. And people don't buy things in focus groups, they buy things usually individually. So they don't need to, so they will not necessarily make actual purchases in the same way that the focus group would indicate. So actually a good focus group moderator will go in and say, well, thank you, John, for that. I want to speak to Carla, who, been a little bit silent. What do you think, Carla? And actually get into that. With the people who are maybe not so quick to speak up. So there's that. Communications has its limits because people don't always communicate clearly or even honestly. I don't mean that they're lying or being intentionally dishonest, but sometimes people feel pressure to give an answer one way or the other. Observations are actually more honest and can be more telling. For instance, if you look at traffic patterns, you could watch traffic patterns in a store and how do people shop, their buying behaviors. A friend of mine who was a photographer in Manhattan, he had to move he was looking to move his studio further downtown because the rents were getting higher and they were lower downtown, but his clients were people from uptown advertising agencies. So he knew that they could get into a cab and get to his studio without any problem, but he was worried about whether once they finished the photo shoot at his studio, could they get a cab and get easily back to their office? Because if they couldn't, after the first photo shoot, they might not come back. If they had trouble getting back to their office, they might be resistant to come. And what he did, and it was actually a very intelligent observation on his part, very thoughtful. And what he did is he hired somebody, not a professional, market research person, but just just an assistant, production assistant, to actually with a clipboard, just mark down in 5 or 10-minute intervals how many uptown cabs were empty. So if somebody wanted to hail a cab, how many cabs were available? And and I thought that was a very intelligent use. He was literally looking at traffic patterns to help his business. We also have observation labs. And this is actually, for instance, toy companies in particular have observation labs because children are a group of consumers who are terrible at communicating their wants and their desires. And actually, I remember as a child not being able to communicate things I felt or wanted to the adults in my life. And part of it is we think the mistake a lot of people make is that they think of children as little adults. They're not. Their brains haven't developed quite as well. For instance, if I were to put a set of 5 toys in front of a child and simply ask, which one is your favorite? They could probably pick their favorite. But if you ask them, what's your second favorite toy? They probably would not be able to do that. They don't have the ability to order things, put things in preferential order. That's a higher level mental function. So what you have to do in that case is take the favorite toy away and say, of the remaining ones, which is your favorite toy? One thing that I think it was Fisher Price realized from their observation labs is that young boys like to play with the same toys that they saw their older brothers playing with. And this included action figures. And they also learned you have to call them action figures, because if you call them a doll, they won't play with it. Dolls are for girls, action figures, a boy can play with an action figure. And sort of interesting, psychological observation there. But they did notice that little boys had a frustration with some of these action figures, and that was standing them up. I don't really have an action figure at hand, but because they couldn't quite balance them. So let's say this pencil is an action figure, and they were having trouble because they didn't have the fine motor skills to be able to balance an action figure straight up. So they observed this frustration, and they realized that this was a problem. This was a need. So they created a new type of action figure that would not have that problem. They had they created was I think called Rescue Heroes, and there are these little action figures, dolls, that had really big feet, very easy to balance. You didn't need the fine motor skills to balance these action figures, and they became very popular. In fact, I think they even at some point had their own Saturday morning cartoon show. So, you can also do experiments, which is well suited for causal research. An example of this would be the McDonald's McGriddle sandwich. Maybe some of you have had the McGriddle sandwich. It's very very high caloric, very decadent. It's they actually tested this sandwich. This is McDonald's is trying to develop new products, and they tested this. They actually developed it and tested it in Houston, Texas. So they had several McDonald's, which I'm not sure if they're owned by McDonald's or there were franchises that agreed to do this testing with them. And essentially they put it on the menu and they advertised it very locally and see if people would buy it. And they did. So as a result, it became a very popular product and still available. They also tested a sandwich called the McLobster sandwich, which didn't quite make the cut. And I actually came across it. I almost ordered it one time. If I had known it was going to be a failure, I would have made sure I ordered. I just wanted to try it and see how good or bad it was. But there you go. You have various contact methods, particularly for surveys. Mail, you can send surveys in the mail. If you want these people to mail it back to you, you better put a self-addressed stamped envelope. And I would only target people who have an interest, definitely have an interest in your product or your service or whatever it is that you are trying to research. Because people are busy, and it's going to be harder to do that. Obviously, you can also do telephone surveys, and these are very commonly used. And they tend to, of course, call at night, usually during dinner. So, you of course have personal. We talked about one-on-one interviewing and focus groups. So these are certainly contact methods, and of course, online surveys and even some online experiments have been done. So there's that. I mentioned sampling previously. A sample is a segment of the population selected to represent the whole. So you ask, smaller group of people what they think, and hopefully if you ask enough people, it will match up to what the overall population says. And by say the overall population, I mean the population of people you're interested in. So might not be the general population of the world. So you also figure out who you're and going to that, you have to figure out who your target, your sample target or unit is. Is it individuals? Is it men? Is it women? Is it children? Is it households? Is it corporations? So you have to be very precise about that. The sample size, how many people do you actually have to ask? How many do you have to survey or interact with? And you want something called statistical significance. And statistical significance means that there are sufficient number of people to reliably represent a larger population. Some statisticians say that you need at least 30 people. In most cases, however, you need a lot more than 30 people. Again, it depends upon what population you're looking at. And there is actually a measurement, and I'm not going to get too technical here, but there's something called a p-value, and the smaller the p-value, the better. And so, for instance, if you have a p-value of 0.1 or 10%, that means there's a 10% chance that your findings are a fluke, that they're not necessarily good. And actually, 10% is a pretty high measure. So you would want a higher statistical significance by having a lower p-value. And a lot of is, how low does it have to be? Well, what's the cost of being wrong? If it's not a big problem, you can go with a higher p-value. But the more you survey, the larger your sample size, the higher your statistical significance will be. So, how are you going to do the samples? And this is actually kind of important. There are various types. One is called a convenience sample, and this is what it sounds like. It's convenient. Yeah. So, for instance, if I go into my classroom and I just do a survey with my students, that's a convenience sample because they're at hand. They're convenient. This would probably be best for exploratory research, probably worst for causal research. So, and probably not pretty good for descriptive research, unless, of course, maybe my target audience is college students or business students. You can also do a simple random sample, and this is kind of what it sounds. You just randomly pick people, but randomness is actually harder to get than you think, because there are so many little things that can bias us. For instance, some people would do something called a mall intercept, where they actually just ask people in a mall and walk up to them and ask them some questions. But the selection of those, whoever you're going to, people tend to be attracted to people like them. So a male surveyor might walk up to a man, a female surveyor might walk up to a woman, more likely to walk up to a woman, and so forth and so on. So sometimes they make arbitrary rules to create arbitrary sampling or random sampling, like 1 out of every 5 people first person passes you, second, third, fourth, and then the 5th you ask, and then after that, then the 5th after that. So they force you to make it really random. For instance, calling people at home, let's say during business hours. Well, who are you going to get? Well, you're going to get people who are retired, people who are homesick, people who work at night. You're not going to get the average person, the person who goes to work during the day. So that's why a lot of people call in the evening. Even if you use a random sample, there's something called a random number generator, and the number is a telephone number. You're not necessarily going to get a random sample. You do the best you can, and there are ways to do that. But there's also something called a stratified random sample, where the people you're looking for may fall into certain groups. Let's say you're going doing a city block, or you're doing a geographic survey. So you randomly pick somebody from a certain block, and then to the next block you randomly pick someone from that block. Or another example would be, let's say I'm surveying students at a 4-year college. So and I want to. So instead of picking randomly from out the college, I might say I'm going to randomly pick 50 freshmen, and then randomly pick 50 sophomores and 50 juniors and 50 seniors, and maybe 50 nighttime or graduate students, because the answers of a freshman will probably be very different than the answers of a senior. So you want to get a more representative sample. The last one here I have here is a judgment sample. This is actually definitely not a random sample. You're actually specifically choosing certain types of people. You're looking for specific characteristics, and sometimes you can do something called pinwheeling, where actually once you survey somebody, you said, could you tell me anyone else like you who I could ask this survey of? This is for when you're looking for very specific types of people that are very difficult to find through random sampling. I worked on one sample for a client this way. My client was interested in sex educators, people who, as a profession, taught sexual education. And because that's not, and often people at a higher level, maybe people PhDs and master's degrees who did this. And so she was looking for a very elite group of people. And so she did a judgment sample, and she would, look for very specific people. It's kind of like trying to get expert opinion. That's maybe another way of saying it. So you have to figure out how you're going to, pick people. Is it really going to be random, going to be convenience, or is it going to be more of a looking for experts in a judgment sample type of thing? Yeah. There are all sorts of research instruments, and I mentioned this previously. Obviously, questionnaires by telephone, online, or in person. The questions you ask are very important. Now, there are generally two types of questions. There's a closed-ended question, which has a limited number of possible answers. It might be yes or no, or true or false, or it might be more like, well, you could say, what's your favorite color? And then you only give maybe 10 colors. But it's limited, where you could also ask that question as an open-ended question. People will say, what's your favorite color? And they might say mauve, or sunset saffron, or some odd, unexpected color. So and a lot of people would make the mistake, well, maybe it's a mistake, maybe it's not, of doing a closed-ended question, but then putting one last checkbox that says other, and then putting a line for people to write in the other. In that case, you've taken a closed-ended question and you've turned it into an open-ended question. Now, why do we even make this distinction? Well, with closed-ended questions, we can use mechanical devices, electronic devices, to tabulate the survey and do the analysis. With an open-ended question, where somebody writes in or gives you verbally a different answer that is not part of a closed set, then you need to have human judgment on what that answer was. Was it appropriate? Somebody says sunset saffron, can we just say that's yellow? Or something else like that. And you hear this I've received a lot of telephone surveys, political telephone surveys, and I don't always like the way they construct their answers. And I'll give them a different answer, even though they're asking a closed-ended question. I give them an open-ended answer, a different answer than they're asking, and which frustrates them, I'm sure. And they have to figure out how to put my question into the bucket that the bucket's available to them. So, and that's one of the limitations of questionnaires. As I also said, the order in which you ask questions. Also, if you ask too many questions, that reduces the likelihood of people completing the survey. So, and is the question, is the survey usable if, let's say you have 50 questions. Is the survey usable if people only answer 40? And this happens a lot in telephone surveys. People will call up and say, oh, it'll just take 10 minutes. And I always look at my watch, and about 20 minutes later, I say, wait a minute, you said there was only 10. What they're really doing is they say 10, so you'll hang on. If they tell them it's 25, if they tell you it's 25, you're probably going to hang up. So they say 10, they lie. But they're trying to get as much data as possible. And that's a challenge. It's a challenge. So, also, in some cases, you need a stimuli, and the stimuli might be usually something to look at, could be something to listen to. Do you like this or like this? Do you like this package design, or this package design? It could be, something like that. So you have to think about that, and will that, work? I think for one survey, I actually had to create an animation to show a product, the way a product would be applied, because we had a new way of applying the product, and it was sometimes difficult to verbally explain it. So we had a little animation showing that. So there are some mechanical instruments available to us. The Nielsen people meters, I don't know exactly what they're using anymore. I think they've changed their methodology since we've become more digital. But the AC Nielsen company has been famous for delivering data on the ratings of television shows, on what people watch. So what they do is they would approach various people in various demographics that they were interested in, and they would say, can we put this box on your TV? We'll pay you so much a month for just, and all you have to do is just watch whatever you watch. You don't have to do anything special. And basically they were, paying these people so they could be monitored. And so they would note, and they would note your demographics, your age, your gender, your ethnic background, that sort of thing. And they would monitor that, and they could tell certain shows attracted certain audiences. They probably updated that. What out of that came this sort of funny story of this years ago. This woman, they noticed she was a single older woman, and she watched 8 hours of PBS a day, but not in the evening. And they thought it was kind of an outlier. So when they approached her, she said, well, no, I don't really watch PBS. I just turn it on and then go to work because I want to help PBS. They didn't need the help, but it's sort of funny. Certainly store scanners are mechanical instruments that can help. On many products, I don't have one here, but have that little barcode, and when you go to check out, you scan that. That data, it's not just to generate the price, that information also goes into the inventory computer, and that data and all the other products that are going through that system can give you information. For instance, we've learned from store scanner data that the days that potato chips and pretzels, things from the salty snack aisle, sell most on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, which is not really a big surprise, but it doesn't sell very well on Monday and Tuesday. Why Thursday and Friday? Because people are getting ready for the weekend, to watch the ball game or some other activity where there's, snack food going to be there. Certainly can add to this a lot of digital measurements, online measurements that are important. I don't have a, bullet point for that, but you can, write that in, because certainly there's a lot of monitoring of online activity and analyzing of that. So some common mistakes that people do in market research. One is, we talked a little bit about that, is having insufficient statistical significance, in that we just don't ask enough people. We don't survey enough. And this is easily corrected. You just have to survey more people, or do, just get more. And that will lower your p-value. There is sampling bias, and I kind of alluded to that, that people will tend to survey people who are like them, or sometimes the bias is intentional, sometimes it's unintentional, but You want to make sure it's objective. And I gave the example of only picking the fifth person, whoever the fifth person is, regardless of gender, ethnic background, age. You just pick that person and approach them. So, interpretation bias is also a problem. You get the results, but interpreting it improperly. This, I think, happens a lot, particularly with that focus group data. For years, my company worked on the premise, for a number of years, worked under the premise that we had three types of customers. They called them the loyalists, people who loved our product, wouldn't use anything else. The second is, we call them the cheapskates. These people would buy whatever's the lowest cost. And then the value seekers, which these were people who preferred lower cost, but they're willing to pay more if they're receiving more. This was based on a series of focus groups. Somebody one day went back to the old videotapes and realized that this was really not true. There were really only two groups. And we've been kind of working under a fallacy at that point. So, another problem is sometimes people treat qualitative data as quantitative. Quantitative is measurable. Qualitative is not really measurable. So, for instance, and I always laugh when I go see my doctor and something's bothering me, and he says, on a scale from 1 to 10, how much does it hurt? I don't know how to answer him. He says, well, 0, it doesn't bother you at all, and 10 is, you're ready to pull your head off. And I don't know, if you said, your pain is 4, and I say my pain is 6, is my pain really more than your pain? It just, and things that are qualitative. And somebody years ago came up with something called, and this was in the social science area, something called a frustration index. I mean, how can you quantify frustration? They're just things you cannot quantify. You know when you feel more or you feel less, but how can you compare that in any quantitative way? And there are people who do that. Now you can, admittedly, you can say, how do people feel? How do they report that they feel? There's do they agree, slightly agree, neutral, slightly disagree, or strongly disagree? And actually, it's better to do 7 increments of that in many cases. It can give you a rough benchmark, but it's not perfect, and because it's not really quantitative. Quantitative things are things that they're hard measurements, and you have to be careful about that. All right, well, obviously, you can't ask me any questions but at this moment, but you could save those questions for class or email them to me. And I hope you will do that. If there's something that you're not clear on, please reach out to me. All right, have a good day then.